So our next speaker is Mr. Shovan Kibria, who is a private sector engagement specialist for the SCALA team. Shovan has over a decade of experience working in the development sector, focusing on social enterprise development and private sector engagement. And he has worked at UNDP for the past 5 years, primarily as a private sector engagement specialist for climate change adaptation. Shovan will present an overview of a toolkit developed by UNDP and FAO for value chain analysis and market development, integrating climate resilience and gender responsiveness. So Shovan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shanali. Yeah, as you just mentioned, I'll be presenting this toolkit, and I want to jump right into it in the interest of time. And the aim of this toolkit is to help countries select and analyze value chains for opportunities to improve both climate change resilience and to reduce gender inequalities, and subsequently to help identify and also prioritize different investments that could help promote value chain development in line with the opportunities identified. So in terms of the background of the toolkit, the entire purpose was of the background behind developing was there was no toolkit out there currently that combines both climate resilience and gender inclusivity as part of the value chain analysis and development process to support these agricultural market development strategies, which makes this a very unique and hopefully very useful toolkit. In terms of the intended user base, it's very broad and includes policymakers, includes planners, project developers, and any other stakeholder really working on the market development of value chains. I'm going to jump right into the toolkit methodology because there's a lot to cover here, and what I'll try to do is give an overview of the kind of broad functionality and what the different analytical pieces of the toolkit are. I want to add that the toolkit has been designed to be modular, so that users can actually pick and choose which parts of the toolkit that they would like to apply, instead of needing to apply the entire toolkit, although the application of the entire toolkit would be recommended and of course produce the best results. The first module, the first analytical piece is the selection of a geographical region for intervention. Assuming a geographical area has not been selected, there is guidance to do so. The two analytical pieces involved are developing a vulnerability mapping through a vulnerability index, which is a product of the exposure index based on existing projecting climate data, sensitivity index, which factors in demographic and ecological indicators, and also the adaptive capacity of people to adapt. So that's socioeconomic and also infrastructural indicators here. So that should provide an index for different geographical regions in terms of the vulnerability. The second piece here is dividing different regions into agroecological zones, which is a methodology that was developed by FAO, and it helps assess agricultural resources in different areas and the potential of various regions basically to produce different crops based on a number of different factors, including resource availability, agroclimatic resources like temperature and precipitation, the suitability of growing different crops, and actual the yield of different crops. So a geographical area, the toolkit essentially guides users to pick a geographical area based on these two pieces, this analysis of different agroecological zones and also vulnerability index. The second piece is the value chain selection process, and that's based on 4 areas. The first is, of course, climate change risks and vulnerabilities. The second is the opportunity to promote gender equality. The third is market demand for different commodities. And the fourth is also an analysis of different government policies and priorities to see if the value chain development would be aligned with these policies and priorities. So the next slide I'm going to show you will be on the value chain mapping. And I'm going to get into a little bit of detail on this. It has many different steps. I won't go into a huge amount of detail to every single piece of the toolkit because there's too much detail. But just to give you an idea of the kind of level of detail in each of these different pieces, I want to go through this value chain mapping process, which would involve collecting a lot of information needed to conduct a value chain analysis. As you can see, there are 11 steps in this toolkit for the value chain mapping process. Starting with mapping the core processes, which is commonly producers, traders, processors, retailers, identifying, mapping the main actors in each of these different value chain nodes, looking at the different climate change risks and vulnerabilities that each of these different actors and nodes face, and then also looking at the number of actors, the jobs, a financial analysis of these different actors, looking at the revenues, profits, margins, how benefits in the value chain are distributed, looking at the flow of products and the volume of products that are flowing, also looking at the flow of information and knowledge, the linkages between different actors, and very importantly, actually mapping the enabling environment. And this includes the rules and standards that are part of value chain, including value chain governments, the infrastructure, policies, trends, things like certification and licensing, and also the supporting functions around the value chain, which include things like access to finance, transport, information, insurance, things like that. The final two steps, one of them is a market analysis, which can be done in multiple different ways. A SWOT analysis could be done, a supply and demand analysis, a survey of different customers. And finally, of course, mapping the gender responsiveness of a value chain. And there are a bunch of different tools that could do this using activity profiles, daily clocks, access and control profiles, just to name a few. So that hopefully gives a good overview of that value chain mapping process. The next piece is the value chain analysis process. And briefly, this looks at four key things again. Finding the most vulnerable groups through the vulnerability index, basically looking at the climate change risks, identifying the value chain constraints based on the mapping process and the information from the mapping process, which would look at the number of actors, jobs, the financials, the flow of information, relationships, linkages, and then also identifying the market-based constraints based on the market analysis. And the final issue would be looking at identifying the gender issues, which would be part of the final step of the value chain mapping process, getting that information. And so the next big module in the value chain toolkit is developing and planning the intervention. After doing the mapping, after doing the value chain analysis, users should be in position to actually follow a number of steps that could allow them to effectively come to a suitable intervention. Then, as you can see, there are a number of different steps here. I won't go through all of these in a lot of detail, but I do want to kind of highlight the different steps involved in this process, just to kind of demonstrate the detail and the fact that each of these different steps, there's a wealth of guidance available, starting with that identification of different interventions, which would primarily involve diversification, climate proofing, supply chain efficiencies, and also making sure that these interventions are market-based and gender responsive. There's an analysis of the interventions, and there are a number of different kind of indicators here that would analyze them, including financial analysis and cost-benefit analysis of a lot of these interventions. Then the next step, of course, would be identifying different intervention activities, looking at whether it should be publicly provided, privately so, or public-private partnership, what would be the best vehicle for actually applying the intervention or implementing it, and looking at different barriers to that and strategies to overcome these barriers, if there are any de-risking strategies that could work. A really important step here that is of course essential is validating all these interventions through a workshop with all the relevant stakeholders, looking at the different constraints and making sure there's a consensus built. This shouldn't be a very academic exercise, which basically gets a lot of information, comes to conclusions without getting the feedback and getting the buy-in from all the stakeholders that would be involved. So this is an extremely important part of the process. And finally, there's identifying, implementing partners, looking at the incentives for different partners to participate, their capacity to do so, what their position in the market is, their reputation, and other factors. So after this entire process, You know, there would obviously, there's an M&E piece that can also guide users using a results-based management approach to see how the interventions would actually, you know, how they would play out. And one piece that is actually missing here that's also part of the toolkit, which is extremely important, is a piece on value chain financing, looking at key factors to consider for facilitating more access to finance, more value chain financing, which looks at enabling environment. It would look at the managing risk in the value chains, and also look at reducing different transaction costs, which could be a key factor to attract more finance in the value chain. So that concludes the presentation on the toolkit. I know I went through it very quickly, and hopefully this really quick run through of the toolkit functionality, you're able to process, participants were able to process some of it and at least get a high level understanding of its use and its utility. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.